So this is Steve, and we're here with Casey Cox today, who is the state representative for House District 85. Had to look there for a second. Republican. He's up for re-election. We wanted to sit down with him and kind of talk with him about this whole experience. And Casey, why don't you remind those of us who maybe don't remember how you came into the office?
Stephen, it's great to see you again. We did this a few years ago, back when I was on the Redevelopment Commission, and it's always fun. So as Stephen mentioned, my name is Casey Cox. I represent House District 85. Have been in office for just over a year, and I came into office after the unfortunate passing of Representative Phyllis Pond. Representative Pond had indicated, I believe in late August, that she wasn't going to run in 2014, and then shortly thereafter indicated she was going to resign in mid-October, and then shortly thereafter that, to my surprise and many others, she passed away. And so a caucus was held in October of 2013, and I came out of the caucus and then started in the legislative session in January, and went through a primary in May of 2014, actually unopposed this November. So that's given me an opportunity to get down to the State House a little bit this past summer and work on some issues of interest for me, and look forward to at least 2 more years at the State House as I continue to learn and do the best I can to serve the people of the 85th District.
Those were some pretty big shoes to fill, too, with Phyllis's.
Yeah, absolutely. I would go door to door for the primary campaign, particularly in New Haven. It was great to hear so many stories about her and how well her constituents thought so highly of her.
What do you think are the top 3 issues that you're going to be facing over the next term?
Yeah, the Speaker Bosma just came out yesterday with the House Republican caucus agenda for 2015. It's a budget year going into 2015. Each odd-numbered year in the legislature is known as a long session, goes from January through late April. It's also where the legislature passes its biennial budget. And so that's the main focus. The main focus, number 1, is passing yet another balanced budget without any tax increases. The second main focus for 2015 is going to be K through 12 education, in particular increasing funding for our K through 12 institutions, and really looking at the funding formula, the foundational funding formula across the state. When this was adjusted a few years ago, it before my time, but has apparently resulted in some inequities among different districts throughout the state, and so we want to take a look at fixing the school funding formula. Third, we're going to be taking a look at our ethics laws for state legislators. In particular, I expect that we will strengthen our disclosure laws. If you were to go down and file to run for state legislative office, Stephen, one of the things that you're required to do is to submit a disclosure statement. And this asks things like, where do you work? Where does your spouse work? Do you own certain stock percentages of various companies, membership interest in LLCs, things like this? And that is to put anyone on notice as to whether or not you may have a conflict of interest in the future, because the legislature deals with everything. I mean, so many different things, so that if that comes up, that this is a public reporting requirement, that someone could say, hey, look, you really shouldn't be voting on this because you have a conflict of interest. Well, some of those issues were questioned this summer, and we're going to come back and strengthen those one way or the other. Probably one of the main, I don't want to say final, but one of the other big priorities of the House Republicans will be focus on public safety. We have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. We want to take a look at our programs and services for domestic violence and domestic abuse victims. And so those are really 4 of the main priorities that we'll be looking at next year. But there will be a whole host of issues as well. When I talked earlier about how how many issues there are that the legislature touches. It's literally everything. I mean, everything from feral cats in trailer parks to dairy products and the cost of grain and roads. You can name anything, and there's something out there that touches, that the legislature touches on some level. Some people would say it's way too much, and I can sometimes certainly agree with and understand that. But it is, there's a lot of learning that goes into it, and you try to pick an area that you can focus on and be helpful in, and then continue to learn from everyone around you as well.
Let's talk a little bit about economic development. And as you mentioned, you'd been on the Redevelopment Commission. But what do you see government's role in economic development as?
I think it can be a facilitator of collaborative relationships. And what I mean by that is this. I had a meeting this morning with someone from one of the major employers in my district. He actually came in from out of town. He was meeting with some folks, and so I had a quick meeting with him as well. And we talked about the lack of skilled workers that so many employers like his company face in Indiana and elsewhere. And we talked about creating collaborative relationships between employers and employees, also potentially with higher education institutions. I spoke to a group from IPFW last night, and we talked about the need to make sure that, particularly with our adult learners, that we, if they've gone to college, either certificate, 2-year, 4-year degree, but haven't finished, we encourage them to go to do that. We encourage relationships between employers and employees to develop that would allow those employees to go back and finish whatever skill certification, 2-year, 4-year degree completion that would be helpful to them. So I think government, I think that it should certainly impose self-limitations on economic development, but it can be a facilitator for encouraging these collaborative relationships. Another great example is with K through 12, which public schools, they're a function of government in Indiana, getting those students into internships and into, let's say, trade and skill employers to begin working alongside folks, working alongside employers towards the latter stages of high school, if that's the area of focus that they want to be in. I think you're going to continue to see that focus on CTE, career and technical education. That's where the government, through that, and just in general how our schools educate its students are major parts of government economic development. And one other item, something that we don't talk very often about, is major function of government is what? Roads, right? I mean, the government builds roads. These are the avenues of commerce. And when we talk about economic development, we sometimes fall into all of this talk about incentivizing through TIF and tax credits and abatements. And I think we're probably entering an age where so many governments, state and local, do all those things that we may get back to talking about more fundamental things like education, but also like infrastructure, roads, quality of those roads, whether particular sites for development exist near railroad tracks or interstates, things like that. So I think those are all important factors that the government has some hand in.
And one of the key roads in your district was just finished within the last couple of years. US 24 made into the 4-lane from what it was, and how has that changed that area? And has it started to change the area as far as making things easier?
Yeah, well, its completion was certainly before my time in the legislature, but to your point, it's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about infrastructure and the routes of commerce being vital to economic development. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't necessarily describe what was there beforehand, but I can tell you that just personally it's something that I utilize much more than I did years ago. So, and you see that in the traffic that uses those channels certainly is likely to lead to additional economic development.
Switch gears a little bit. There's been some talk about election reform. One of the things mentioned is talking about extending the voting hours on election day. Do you think that's something that's necessary given that we have all this early voting that's available to us?
Great question. I guess I don't see the harm in extending it. I suppose there may be some cost with respect to paying poll workers, but I don't oppose taking a look at it. Indiana actually 6 to 6 is our hours, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Are some of the more narrow hours that we have in the country. You correctly point out, though, that we do seem to see an expansion of early voting. I think that along election law issues, we'll probably tend to see more discussion about things like redistricting. We passed a law last year in the House, passed a bill, excuse me, in the House. Didn't get a hearing in the Senate, but it would have set up a nonpartisan redistricting commission. Many states have adopted commissions like this, and try to remove politics from the equation as far as redistricting goes. Historically, I imagine both parties have been accused of gerrymandering districts, and so I think you'll probably see some discussions along those lines going forward. And I'm on the elections committee right now. I don't know if I will be going forward. I presume I will. But I think it's certainly a discussion worth having about extending the hours. It's funny you bring that up. The other day was walking by early voting, where early voting takes place downtown, and I thought, well, I kind of want to go and vote, but I also cherish going on election day. There's something civically minded about it, I think. And I don't know if a lot of people think that like that. If so, I suppose there's great merit in extending the hours so that people can get off work and go vote. But if that's not the case, then maybe we're doing okay with just early voting. So I think it's a good discussion to have. I'd be happy to have it.
Do you think that, like we were talking about the commission, the nonpartisan commission that would do the redistricting, do you think efforts like that might mean more in translation of voters coming to the polls than early voting or some of the other issues? I notice one thing that I hear is, why bother?
Yeah.
My district is Republican, I'm a Democrat,
That's
why
a good
bother?
question, sure. Well, I think the goal of a nonpartisan redistricting commission is to remove the politics of it. And would that actually result in districts that are closer to 50-50? Maybe some. I really don't know the answer to it, actually. I think the real issue there, what's going on is you do something like that to instill public trust in government. And whether that results in districts that are closer to 50-50 or it results in districts that are further away from where they are right now, you do it to instill public trust, public confidence in government. And I think that there's an argument that could be made that the more confidence people have in their government, the more likely they are to want to participate in it, therefore more likely to vote. So I think there's an argument there. At the same time, of course, we have to be mindful of people's schedules and making sure that we accommodate everyone and enfranchise people so that they can exercise their right to vote in a convenient fashion.
There's been a lot of efforts. It's sort of gaining momentum. It's getting to the stage maybe where we'll see some fruition in the next 5-10 years. Passenger rail service in this area. It's not really so much perhaps an issue that you deal with at the legislature,
right.
But is it an issue that you're invested in, that you see the value of?
I can understand why there are a number of people who advocate for it. I don't think it's something that the legislature would necessarily take up anytime soon. The cost of it, I think, would be more overwhelming than the state could deal with. So if something like that happens, I think it's something that the federal government is going to have to take up. I've been to Europe. I've been to Europe twice, and I've ridden on the trains there, and I recognize how useful they are. I'm not entirely sold that our American society would utilize it as much. Not to say I think it's a bad idea by any means, but you know, they all adopted the metric system. We haven't after all these years, right? So I think that it should be carefully approached, and it's certainly the case should be made that that this would be utilized, and that we shouldn't say expend resources instead on improving our highways and developing more efficient vehicles and things like that.
Any thoughts on healthcare?
A hot topic. Yeah, we'll see going forward. I mean, we're in a period of change and transition. A lot of nervous people out there with the Affordable Care Act being implemented. I'm one of them. You know, we're finding out that a lot of the promises that the federal government made when enacting that simply aren't true. The state itself is moving forward with the Healthy Indiana Plan 2.0. I don't think we have a response yet back from the federal government as to whether or not that's going to be acceptable to them under federal law. So it's a moving target, and it's something that people are very concerned about. And as issues arise in the legislature regarding it, it's something that I think every member of the legislature has to stand up and take notice of.
Talk a little bit about sentencing reform, criminal sentencing reforms, and I'm thinking mainly of, for instance, some of the drug sentences.
Yeah.
Is that something that needs to be taken a look at by the legislature? Are we out of line on those?
It has been. We've taken a look
okay.
at it actually, and there's still some issues that. Talking about issues that we address next year. One of them, when I talked about public safety earlier, one of the issues that we'll address is funding for local governments with respect to rehabilitation of minor offenders. Because we passed House Enrolled Act 1006, which is a criminal code reform, and the underlying philosophy of the new criminal code is essentially that. Look, bad people, bad actors, bad criminals, the worst of the worst and violent offenders, people who should be locked up need to be locked up, and we need to make sure that we punish them adequately and that they are sent to prison. And so actually we saw with criminal code reform increases in a lot of the penalties that you would associate with violent and violent offenders, the worst of the worst type. The other part of it, the equation, is that same attitude with respect to making sure we lock away people who need to be locked away doesn't apply necessarily to, say, minor drug offenders, and that it would be more beneficial to society if we focus on treatment, mental health, rehabilitation, and we do not incarcerate them for a few years. Think about someone who commits a minor drug felony, and we send them away, let's say, for 2-3 years in prison. Think about what we've done to family that they may have. They have children. They're not there to provide for those children. You're putting them into an environment with some of the worst that I talked about earlier sometimes, and the likelihood that they come out and that they are truly rehabilitated is not great. In fact, you may have actually damaged the likelihood that they're going to be able to contribute to society. So, and many of these crimes happen because of addiction problems, and so if we can treat those issues and recognize that those folks are different than the really bad guys, we can make progress, I think, on crime in general, rates of crime and recidivism. So that's really the underlying philosophy of House Enrolled Act 1006. And one of the items that was in there, it essentially kept some offenders local, which of course would create a burden on local governments. Or counties run our jails, right? And so we're going to come in and find out how we can deal with that. But I think we are rightfully we have rightfully taken some action in that capacity, and are continuing to look at how we can improve it. You know, I think we all want to be tough on crime, and as important as it is to be tough on crime, we also have to be smart on crime, and that's really where that comes down.
Anything else you wanted to talk about we didn't cover?
Yeah, I just mentioned a couple items that I've been working on. 3 bills being drafted right now. I anticipate I'll have a handful more. I don't. We have a 10 bill limit for a long session. I really don't have an interest in filing a bill, filing as many as I can just so I can do it. In fact, one of the bills I'm involved with, I'm not an author of it, but I am involved with and was involved somewhat last year, is a government reduction bill that actually repeals a bunch of laws. People would say to me, "You pass so many laws. Why don't you guys make a law that says for every law we pass, we're going to repeal another one?" And that's hard to do. You never know what you may be picking and choosing among laws that you might need that you had to repeal. But what you can do is you can scrub the code and look at what might be duplicative, unnecessary, archaic, and get rid of those. There were some laws on the books last year. We got rid of 2,500 lines of code last year. I think it was 30 boards and commissions. And one of the bills that I contributed to that was a small business regulation bill for businesses businesses that were closing up and how they advertised. And it was something I dealt with in my legal practice, and I thought it was totally unnecessary. So we were able to get that one repealed. It was the first example of my time in the legislature where I thought, hey, I've been able to apply my real world experience to the legislative process, and now there is a legal change because of that, and that's very gratifying. It's why you do this, to be able to have an impact like that. But just briefly, 3 other items. Very interested in higher education, specifically college debt issues, $1.2 trillion nationwide on college students. I'm working on some legislation that is similar to something that is voluntary that Indiana University already does. But as far as I can tell, other institutions in the state, public and private, don't do it. I won't go into a lot of detail other than to say it's very simple, and it's resulted in an 11% decrease of $33 million in student borrowing in 1 year for IU students. And it may be the sort of thing that I just get together and I file it, and then I go and take it and create a discussion with our higher ed institutions about, get commitments from them, and then we drop it. I don't know, or it may be something that's ripe for legislation. We'll see. I was just on the phone today about a bill I'll be filing that would establish a new class of corporation in Indiana, completely voluntary, a new corporate entity. It wouldn't change anything that's existing, but would further what's called social entrepreneurship, particularly attractive to millennials. This legislation essentially allows for-profit companies to pursue profit, but also to embed a public benefit mission within their articles of incorporation, and requires their board of directors to also pursue that. These corporations exist currently in 27 states and the District of Columbia, and they exist in red states like Utah, Arizona, and South Carolina, and blue states like New York and California, and purple states like Florida and Virginia. So it's something I think that could be helpful to entrepreneurs in Indiana. And finally, I've been for some time taking a look at Indiana's safe haven law, which is a law that allows mothers who maybe have just given birth, an unintended, unwanted pregnancy, to deliver that child to a safe haven within 30 days of the child's delivery. So this is a mechanism that is intended to be an alternative to abortion and an alternative to abandonment. We read these terrible stories too often in Indiana and elsewhere, but particularly we've read quite a few of them in the past couple of years in Indiana about mothers who they're young and troubled and scared, and they've given birth in a bathroom. They left the child in the toilet. They've deposited the child in the garbage can. There was a case, I think it was last year or the year before, in which a young woman left her child, newborn child, in a shopping bag outside in February. The child froze to death, and the forensic examiner indicated that while the child was slightly premature, there was no reason that the child couldn't have survived. So we have the safe haven law in place to address those situations, and it has worked pretty well, but I've been concerned about why we continue to see what I think is an unacceptable number of child abandonments. So I've been having conversations with experts and others who I've consulted about how we may reasonably expand this law and really get at what I think is a major issue of the existing law, the issue of anonymity. A young woman can take the child to an emergency service provider, no questions asked. So in that sense, there is anonymity. If you look at it from the eyes of this young, presumably young, scared, presumably possibly teenage mother, the difficulty in actually carrying a child into, say, a hospital, handing that child over, is probably very scary. In fact, I've talked to people who have been in similar situations and have talked about how scary it is. So I have some draft legislation I was just reviewing last night that we're going to try to get at some of those issues, and hopefully we'll save some lives when we do it.
Is just in listening, is 30 days enough? Should that be looked at as well?
Some states have as few, I think, as 72 hours. Others, I think, maybe take it to 60, 90 days. I think that's a question worth asking. In my draft right now, I continue to have it at 30 days. I think the language actually says less than 31, so 30 days. You really don't know, of course. I mean, are we going to be able to say a child is 32 days or 29 days? But we have to set some parameter, because we don't want someone, we don't want, say, a parent to be upset with their 6-month-old because they got sick or something. There's some frustration, and we open a Pandora's box. And this, what we really want are the emergency situations, and that's why we've left it. That's why we really should have a reasonable cap, but also a pretty strict cap, because it shouldn't be an alternative to adoption. It should definitely be an alternative to abortion, but it shouldn't be an alternative to adoption in the sense that someone who is waiting longer and they have some problems, perhaps going through the parental termination and going through the adoption procedures it's going to be much more beneficial than, say, just dropping the baby off. We really want to focus on those emergencies, and the law should be limited to that. But it's still worth the discussion as to whether that's 30 days, 45 days, 72 hours. I mean, whatever it is.
Okay. Anything else, Casey?
No, I think that's it. It's great to see you again, Stephen.
Yeah, it was very good to see you.
Look forward to staying in touch.
Same here, and we wish you well in November.
Hey, I was telling my wife, as long as I get one vote, I would think that I'll be there for 2 more years, but you never know.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.